Can I welcome Assembly members and members of the public, both here and watching on webcast, to today's meeting of the Police and Crime Committee. Our main item of business today is a question and answer session with MOPAC, Mayor's Office on Policing and Crime, and the Metropolitan Police Service. But first, we have a few short items of formal business to go through before we begin this discussion. Members of the public may like to follow us on Twitter at Linden Assembly and take part in the meeting discussion using hashtag Assembly Police. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any unnecessary interruptions this morning. Item 1, apologies for absence. And
Thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received from Assembly Member Dismal.
Okay. Declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2? Noted. And can I also ask some Assembly members to declare any other disclosable pecuniary interest and other relevant interests, including any declarations in relation to gifts and hospitality, which are not reflected in the authorities' register of gifts and hospitality, where they relate to the items on the agenda for today's meeting? Noted. Okay. Item 3, minutes. Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meetings of the Police and Crime Committee held on the 3rd of July 2019 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. Item 4, list of actions. Can I ask the committee to note the completed, ongoing and closed actions arising from previous meetings of the committee as listed in the report? Yep. Thank you. Item 5, we now move to our main item of business, which is our monthly question and answer session with the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime and the Metropolitan Police Service. And I would like to welcome our guests, Sophie Linden, Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime, and Sir Stephen House, Deputy Commissioner, Metropolitan Police Service. And at 11 o'clock, we'll be joined by Claire Wexman, Victims Commissioner for London. So we shifted the agenda around to accommodate Claire. So we'll start off with a question from me on the Notting Hill Carnival. So Deputy Commissioner, if you could give me your assessment of the success of Carnival this year from a policing perspective. And then also, what are your thoughts on the Metropolitan Police Federation's call for a review of Carnival after the number of police officers were assaulted during the event? And I'll invite you, Deputy Mayor, to come in on that item, on that particular point as well. So if I can start off with you, Sir Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the figures, which is one way of analysing Carnival, these are the sort of the definitive figures as we have them at this moment in time. There were 478 offences recorded with a Carnival flag on them, which is down significantly on 2018. We saw, as always, the highest number of offences were drugs offences, at 193 drugs offences. And I think one of the reasons why the Police Federation is making the call it made is because the next highest category of offences was assaults on police, which was 33 assaults on police. Though that is 5 less than the previous year, just to put it into some context. But the fact that it's down 5 isn't really any sort of excuse in terms of 33 officers. And those injuries range from being spat at and spat in the face, which some people may find, well, is that, you know, I'm not suggesting anyone here, but might feel, well, that's not that serious. Of course, if you're spat at in the face, you have to go through a check to make sure that you're not going to be subjected to some viral infection. And that treatment, if it has to be carried out, can last weeks and sometimes months and creates a huge amount of anxiety in the officers. And I've spoken to many officers who said, quite frankly, if it was a choice between being spat in the face and punched, they'd rather be punched. Because although it might hurt more, it's immediate and you know what you're dealing with. But we also had officers who were bitten and head-butted. One officer was bitten on his calf. The most serious injury was when an officer fell over and lacerated his hand quite badly on broken glass. But any assault on police, I think, is unacceptable, and I understand why the Federation are asking for that review. In terms of the number of arrests, there were 354 arrests in total this year, and we had 37 arrests for assault on police. Obviously, we had 33 offences, but I'm imagining that was because on several occasions there was more than one person assaulting a police officer. In terms of stop and search, we recorded 1,709 stop and searches. That number may go up as records are submitted, but that will be about the number. That's less than the previous year, and the reason for that will be simple, I would suggest, which is that last year members will remember that there was a section 60 in place throughout the 2 days, whereas this year, and it's a positive sign, this year we didn't feel the intelligence justified a section 60 on the Sunday, but it did on the Monday, so it was put in place for the Monday, and the vast majority of the searches this year, as in most years, were under section 60. So there were just over 1,000 section 60 searches and just under 700 searches under PACE. In terms of how the Carnival went, it was as usual, I think, which was very good atmosphere on the Sunday and on the Monday morning and afternoon, but towards the evening of Monday, the nature and tone of the Carnival changes somewhat and becomes more confrontational, and that's when we get more problems. That's always been the case, and it was certainly the case this year. Heat was a particular issue this year for officers, and we had many officers suffering with heat exhaustion, and 2 taken to hospital, a couple with suspected serious medical conditions, but actually turned out to be heat-induced, and luckily not as serious as we first thought. And that was despite huge efforts by our staff to get as much water and food out there as possible. I know that the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor and you, Chair, all observed on a couple of the days, and I'm sure you saw the efforts that were going into getting water out there and keeping the officers well hydrated. But it was, as we know, extremely, extremely warm, and with the equipment they were wearing, made it much, much worse. In terms of Carnival organisation, encouraging signs. So this was the second year of the same organisers, and I met with the organiser, the head of the organising committee, a couple of times actually on the Monday when I was there, and there was signs of good close working between the organisers and the police. A couple of, and I think that's a positive development, and we hope it will continue. A couple of areas where we still have concern. One was with the stewarding, which we feel still needs to be more professional. So some of the stewarding within the events, within the arena events is good, but the general stewarding on the route still leaves a bit to be desired. And the other issue was float safety. And this year, unusually, we had incidents with 2 floats, one where one of the large sound systems fell off a float and injured a member of the public, which obviously is completely unacceptable, and another one where a float stuck under one of the bridges because it was too high, which again really is not acceptable, bearing in mind it then causes the whole procession to stop. That causes congestion and can be very dangerous. So that's going to have to be looked at for next year by the organisers. In general, we think it was a further step forward in terms of a safe and secure carnival, but if I was to be asked, do I think that the crowd congestion is still at a safe level yet? There's a way to go, I think. We still worry about crowd congestion, and that's why we're so concerned about the stewards, and we're so concerned about keeping the carnival procession moving. I'm sure members know this, but it's probably just worth restating. The problem arises the minute that the floats stop. Because the minute the floats stop, the supporters following the floats stop as well, and then the crowd just gathers and gathers around the static floats, and it becomes very, very difficult for crowd congestion. And I think also for next year we need to look at where some of the static sound systems are. There were too many static sound systems grouped in one section of the footprint, and that needs to be addressed for next year because it caused quite a lot of problems with crowd density that we were concerned about and did have to take action on during Monday to put officers into the crowd to try and relieve some of the pressure on the people in the crowds. So it sounds like I've got a number of caveats. I do. We are still concerned about it. It's still a massive event. We still deployed something like 15,000 officers across the whole of the footprint on the days, the biggest deployment being Monday. It can't be acceptable for officers and 30-odd officers to be assaulted, and it can't be acceptable that the floats cause injury to members of the public. So I think there's still progress to be made, but we do feel we are making progress.
Thank you for that, Sir Stephen. Deputy Mayor, can I ask you for your observations?
Absolutely. I mean, I echo what the Deputy Commissioner says around the absolute unacceptability of any assaults on police officers. And I'm really grateful for those police officers that were out there during the 2 days of the Carnival. I was there on Monday and it was just unbelievably hot, and I do not know how they managed to. I'm surprised there weren't more officers with heat exhaustion because it was just so hot. And I know you were there on Sunday, equally really difficult temperatures. The Carnival itself appeared to be really, what it should be, a real celebration of diversity and cultural heritage. And clearly there are some issues that we need to look at as a partnership with the Metropolitan Police, the London boroughs involved, Kensington, Chelsea and Westminster, and the Carnival organisers. And as usual, there will be a proper and detailed debrief which will take place in the next couple of weeks to really make sure that the lessons are learned, any issues around crowding or too many static sound systems can be looked at so that can be put in, appropriate measures can be put in place for next year. It is, as we all know, an absolutely huge event, really successful event. There are still issues, but I do think the Carnival and the safety of Carnival has progressed and moved a long way, certainly since I was Deputy Mayor. And the new organisers I pay tribute to them and their professional attitude. I visited the coordination centre at the Carnival, the ELT, really, and I don't know if other Assembly members had the opportunity to do so, a significant step forward in terms of proactive partnership working, engagement, understanding what was happening, really understanding and proactive work with the Metropolitan Police. But clearly we've got to learn the lessons and make sure that next year there's issues around float height, number of sound systems on floats and things like that are properly addressed.
Can I bring in at this stage Assemblyman Hall, who was also there on the Sunday?
Yes, I was, and I'd like to echo the praise for the officers. It was extremely hot, and when you think that they're wearing stab vests, absolutely. I mean, I was with two extremely good officers, and when they took their stab vests off when we got in the car, they were drenched. It was so bad. So I'd really like to compliment all of them. Last year, a lot of the success for bringing things down was put down to the fact that you arrested so many people in the weeks leading up to the event. First, did you do the same again this year? Secondly, I assume you did. Therefore, how many people were visited or spoken to before the event?
So you'll be aware that what we've done in recent years is rather than particularly badge event our operations in the run-up to the Carnival as Carnival related. Actually, it's just part of ongoing work to reduce violence. But in the weeks leading up to Carnival, we arrested 1,700 people for violence-related and drugs offences. We carried out several hundred search warrants on addresses. And we put particular effort and care into making sure that a number of these people, if they were released after investigation, were bailed rather than RUI'd, and bailed with conditions to stay away from Carnival, so that we would avoid any trouble there. And we believe that was successful this year, as it has been in recent years. But it's more of an integrated approach now. So rather than stop doing all our anti-violence work and just say, right, we're going to concentrate on Carnival, we try to run the two together in a more efficient way, so that we're impacting both of these issues in the run-up to Carnival. But I think that the arrests and the activity leading up to Carnival do help to provide a safe and secure Carnival.
I'd agree, but I sometimes think that if you look at those 1,700 people, and clearly there's a thought to Carnival on that puts more of an emphasis on how dangerous it really could be if you weren't so proactive such a long time ahead of it, which is for those of us that are very concerned about the Carnival and concerned about the amount of time it takes the police to deal with the policing of this. I think it should be put into the mix because it is part and parcel of the police doing the very best they can in terrible circumstances, because where this Carnival is so difficult to police. I think those figures should go into it because it gives a better view of what's actually going on. There were 34, I read, offensive weapons. Are they going to, because it's been indicated to me that they weren't just little knives, some of them were staggeringly awful pieces.
Machetes.
Yes, machetes. Okay. Are you going to publish what you actually got off the streets on those days?
I'm not sure if that's planned or not. I've certainly seen photographs of a machete that was seized on the Sunday night. That's part of the reason why we put Section 60 in place on the Monday, because of that that incident on the Sunday night. I'm not sure whether we're going to be publishing them as a group photographs. I can come back to you on that.
Okay, I personally think it's a good idea because I think people need to see what you as a police force are up against. I'm glad you mentioned the spitting and how absolutely vile it is to be spat at, and therefore it underlines the great amount of pressure we put upon the Metropolitan Police for the rollout of spit guards, which I'll talk to the Mayor about at another point. Do you actually think it's appropriate to send so many officers into a situation where every single year we can almost guarantee that of them will be injured?
I'm not sure if I'd say appropriate, but that's our duty. So that's what we do.
But
officers come to work knowing that they are at risk of being assaulted. So
okay.
if you're suggesting that the Carnival is inherently dangerous, well, 99.9% of the people who go to Carnival go to have a good time, and I think most of them do have a good time. And the vast majority of the people there enjoyed it and probably didn't see any trouble at all. It's our job to try and make sure that we take out the troublemakers beforehand, and as your question has indicated, I think we do achieve that in a large measure, but we can never achieve it completely. There is alcohol at Carnival. Alcohol, particularly, and heat will drive some levels of aggression and violence, and officers understand that's likely to be the case. It is a massive event in London and indeed in Europe, and it's bound to have a level of drink and antisocial behaviour and violence associated with it. We'll do all we can to reduce it. I would love it if no officers got assaulted. That would be fantastic, and that ultimately must be the aim of Carnival and the Carnival organisers. I'm sure they join with us in that concern. But all the while Carnival exists, and we believe it needs policing, and clearly it does at the moment, we will deploy police officers too.
Yes, I do accept your comments completely. But I mean, if you're looking at it from a public order point of view, do you think it's outgrown the venue, if you like?
Having sort of been involved in Carnivals on and off since 2001, I think any debate about has it outgrown the location is probably redundant. It is the Notting Hill Carnival. And I know there's been talk in the past about moving it to other venues, but then if it was moved to another venue, it wouldn't be the Notting Hill Carnival. And I think when you meet the organisers and you talk to the people that enjoy Carnival year in, year out, it's associated with that part of London.
I know, but
it's not my job, frankly, to say. I'm giving an opinion.
I will just say to you then, I think sending so many police officers into a situation where we know they're going to get injured, and some of them over the years very, very badly, I think that perhaps something should be rethought. But I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay. Remember Whittle and then Shalom. Peter.
Yeah. Morning. I just want to ask just a factual question, really. What was the size? Do you have an estimate number of people who attended Carnival? And basically, when is it at its most crowded?
Well, to be honest with you, I've got figures on virtually everything. I'm not sure if I've got an overall attendance figure. I can tell you when it's at its most crowded, and that's on the Monday. What particular point? I would suggest mid-afternoon on Monday from my personal observations. I think a lot of people start to leave around about 5, 6 o'clock, and either less desirable elements arrive at 5 or 6, or because everybody else is leaving, they are more obvious around about that time. But I would say mid-afternoon is peak period on a Monday.
So you just don't... is it right that the police now, for some reason, don't issue figures on crowd numbers? Do that something?
We don't think there's any accurate way of recording that. So you've got to bear in mind, of course, I know you know this, but I mean, Carnival is not ticketed. We don't count people in and count people out. So it's impossible to know really what the numbers are. And I'm sure you could put a grid square over the crowd and assume certain density and try and come to a total, but you would never get agreement.
I mean, the figure that's, I mean, it's very difficult to get an absolute precise figure, but the figure that, the estimate is about 1 million people over the course of a weekend. How accurate that is, I don't know, but that is the figure that I've been given.
Flo.
Thank you. Good morning, Deputy Mayor. Morning, Deputy Commissioner.
Morning.
Just to echo your comments and agree that actually Carnival is a cultural event. It's not an event where the police need to be forceful. It's not a demonstration. It's not a protest. It's a range of people coming together to celebrate everything that's good about London and the Caribbean community. And also, obviously, this year we had the 72-second silence to remember the Grenville victims. I just wanted to know what, from your perspective, the work with the organisers, who I think have done a lot in terms of making sure that this year's event was a lot more peaceful, a lot more successful. Is there anything you'd change in the run-up to next year to try and make sure that, again, we see a quite peaceful and enjoyable event for everyone to enjoy?
Good question. I'm not sure I'd change it. I'd say more of the same. So you'll probably be aware we ran a planning event, a joint planning event at Hendon Training Centre with the organisers for a day. That was, I think you came to that, no? But that was very useful. And I think it helped sort of start to build a team ethos between ourselves and the organisers, which worked well on the day. So Deputy Mayor said she visited the ELT where the organisers work from, so did I. And there are police officers embedded in that. And I think the communication worked well, because inevitably with the sort of event we're talking about, there are problems. You know, floats get delayed, stuck, people can't get in or out with various vehicles that need to get in or out, and it has to be resolved minute by minute. And I think if you've got a team spirit there, then that does certainly help. So I would just say more coordination, more joint training. I would emphasise, and we've already said it to the organisers, and they know it, stewarding is still a big issue. It's all very well having loads of stewards, but if they don't feel empowered or they're not properly trained and directed and led, they're not going to do the work that we need doing, and that's when we have to deploy police officers to do that, and we really shouldn't have to deploy police officers to do stewarding duties. But because of crowd safety, it's a necessity at times.
Yeah.
But I would echo, I do think that is going in the right direction. It would be good if we could have conversations with them, picking up on the question earlier, conversations specifically about how do we reduce the number of assaults on police officers, what can we do there, and there are things we could do, I'm sure, to do that. As I said earlier, one of the things that we think works well are the arena events where actually, although you're in the footprint of Carnival, you actually have to gain entry into it's like Rampage, for example, very well organised, very well stewarded, and really takes care of its own footprint very, very well, and it means we don't have to. We would encourage more and more of those sort of enterprises within the Carnival footprint.
Yeah, and I know that's something a number of the big promoters and DJs are thinking about in terms of their crowds, their audiences that come. The other thing I just wanted to ask finally was around the figures that you quoted for the arrests.
Yeah.
Of the 1,000 under Section 60 and the 700 odd. Do you have just a breakdown?
They weren't arrests, they were stops.
Stops.
Yeah.
With the just a rough estimate in terms of breakdown of age profile.
I don't have that at the moment, I'm afraid. We wouldn't have got that by this stage. I can get it to you in due course.
Thank you.
I mean, inevitably, it's probably going to be fairly young. Well, I say inevitably, maybe not. Yeah.
I would assume on the Monday it would have been maybe sort of more older adults and younger adults as opposed to young teenagers.
You might be. I don't know. So I shouldn't talk without the analysis.
No,
so
that's fine.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Right, just 2 points on my part, and then in the next section. I attended the ELC myself on site, and again, the joint working of all different agencies, including a representative from the GLA, was very impressive. And secondly, it goes without saying that we thank you, through you, all the officers who were on duty over the weekend, and indeed in the run-up to Carnival, for all the work that they did in sometimes very difficult circumstances.
Yeah, I think this year was a particularly difficult year for officers because of the heat. I mean, I know it seems quite a glib thing to say, but it was so unbearably hot, particularly on the Monday, and officers all wearing the protective equipment and the vests, but then you had other officers who were wearing the full, what we call baby grows. I mean, they are incredibly hot inside those. So the officers did an amazing job, just carrying out their functions so well in such heat and in some extreme circumstances.
This was 2 years ago. This committee produced a report titled Making Carnival Safer and Better. I think some of the recommendations are still as relevant as ever, and there are issues which, because of time, I won't go into now, but Deputy Mayor, I'll will write to you with the marketing of the Carnival and so on, maximising the economic potential.
I mean, as I said, there'll be a proper debrief, a partnership debrief will take place from the partnership group, and we certainly could look at the report to see if there's anything within that that actually, if it hasn't been implemented already, what recommendations were that might be useful.
Thank you. So, moving on, conscious of the time, we now move on to the issue of violence, and I'll ask Sylvia Whittle to lead on this.
Okay. Can I start on the issue of violence, and particularly of, obviously, knife crime? A broad question of you both. We've seen a recent increase in Section 60 powers. So how do you anticipate this reducing violent crime in the capital? If I could maybe start by asking you, Deputy Commissioner.
So the Commissioner has made it clear her views on stop and search from the time she took over the role of Commissioner, which is that it should be used as an effective police tactic. It should be used professionally by officers, and that complaints arise when it's not done professionally and we don't explain properly what we're doing. We've seen stop and search numbers grow month on month over the last, I think, 12 months now. And we still maintain that stop and search is an effective tool. Section 60, a subset of stop and search, is particularly effective, and you are well aware, because we discussed it before, it's done around either violent incidents or the anticipation of violent incidents. The recent changes that the government has introduced, reducing the level back down for authorisation to inspector, is something that we have taken on board. We haven't seen, I don't think as a result of that, a massive increase in the use of Section 60, because the Met obviously always had on duty and on call a senior officer whose job it was to authorise Section 60s. So the fact that it's now gone to inspector level hasn't necessarily changed our attitude to the use of it. But for instance, in the tragic murder last night of a young boy through a stabbing incident, Section 60 was put in place. And we will continue to use it as and when we think it's an appropriate measure to use.
Could I ask you, obviously we've had various announcements, excuse me, from the government, or the new government, haven't we, about this subject and about the need for stop and search, etc. I just wonder, what effect, if any, do those public announcements make, i.e. in people's awareness, people who might be carrying knives, people's awareness? As I understand it, there's always a bit of a gap between what people think might happen to them and what is the reality, as it were. So this was very highly publicised. Would that have filtered down already, as it were?
I think, I suppose my answer to that is regardless of what the government is saying, I think people in London are aware that the Met is doing more stop and search. Communities are aware that there is more stop and search being done.
They really are.
And that's greeted positively in many areas, but it's greeted with some concern in others. And where it's greeted with concern, it's our job to try and explain why we're doing it, and try and make sure that the local communities and particularly the advisory groups are confident that we're using the power appropriately and within professional parameters. I don't think there's any sort of lack of awareness in Londoners that stop and search has been on the increase. We talk about it a lot, and I think officers are exercising the power increasingly. We're seeing more officers from territorial units as opposed to specialist units embracing stop and search, almost relearning the power and using it more effectively. And we think that's to the good. We will continue to monitor our stop and search. As you know, we've got about 20,000 body-worn cameras out there with our officers. In round about 90% of our stop and search cases, the body-worn video is on, and we will review that if there's any problems. Officers turn it on because they know it protects them as much as anything else. And that indicates to me that the vast majority of our stop and searches are done properly and are done professionally. But I don't think there's any real need for us to publicise the fact around stop and search. I think people know they're going to get stopped and searched if there is a reason for it.
I see. You've already mentioned briefly there, but about how you engage with stakeholders, as it were, about you know when a Section 60 is going to be in operation.
Yes.
Who, first of all, would those? I know it must vary from area to area, but who would those stakeholders be? And how do you go about doing it?
Right. So one of the issues that we're very keen to do is to make sure that, for instance, if we're anticipating violence or there's been a violent incident, particularly there's been a homicide, we are very keen to make sure that, I'll call them our stakeholders for the time being, our partners, our stakeholders are aware of what we're doing. They're aware of the incident and they're aware of our response to it. So in one incident that I checked up on, I saw the email that had gone out to our partners explaining that there'd been a violent incident and that a Section 60 was in place, and there were 91 recipients of that email.
91?
91 recipients of that email. I didn't memorise them, but I can tell you that it would be local authority partners and a number of people in the local authority, including the leader and the chief exec, but working down through the local authority as well. It would be local community groups, it would be local MPs, it would be local councillors, to try and spread as wide as possible the knowledge of what's happened and what we were doing about it, but perhaps putting a Section 60 in place. It will vary from place to place because everyone has a different network of partners. It's done by email in some places, it's done by texts in others, and I'm sure in many other places it's done through informal phone calls as well.
Would that include hospitals?
It would do in some areas, potentially, yes, but I wouldn't think that they would be top of our list. Our main issue is around local authority partners and local public representatives and elected officials.
I'm sorry to be so detailed about it, but it's quite important. You mentioned your example there with the email. What's the kind of time scale then? You have an incident, you think, like, we've got to have a Section 60. What is it? And then you send out a communication. Would that be in a period of how many hours?
So when I get told about a homicide, and I'm usually told by text within, I would say, half an hour to an hour of it happening, the first question I will ask, often back to the officer reporting it to me, is how local partners been informed. Almost always the answer is yes. But I need to be clear, it will depend on time of day as to who receives the message and at what time they receive it. So if we send an email, people aren't going to get that at 3 o'clock in the morning, although we may well send it at 3 o'clock in the morning. So the inspector on duty will often be charged with contacting local partners. But if that's 3 o'clock in the morning, we don't really expect our local partners to respond to it straight away. But we do expect them to be aware of it when they open up their emails in the morning. And also, often the practicality is around, if it's been a homicide or a big incident, we'll run some sort of gold group of partners to discuss what's happened and discuss what the implications are. That would probably be set for the following morning or midday, something like that, and we would expect partners to respond and come to that. I can't put a hard and fast rule in it because obviously we work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
It's important to get an impression of how you work. Yeah. Deputy Mayor, could you tell me, what are the most up-to-date figures for reduction in injury? I did read just in the press a while ago there'd been, I think it was in Sunday Times, there'd been something like a 20-25% reduction in injury under 25-year-olds. Do you have more detailed, more up-to-date figures? This must have been about a month ago.
So it's the reduction in knife crime with injury for under 25s is just over the last year has been just below 20%.
Just below 20?
Yeah, it is 20%, isn't it? Yeah.
You mean that's for all age groups, as it were?
No, knife crime with injury for the under 25s.
Under 25.
And clearly all knife crime and injury is incredibly important, but that is one of the key figures that we are monitoring to give us an idea about what's happening around knife crime that you're asking about. That is the key figure that we've been monitoring. It's down by nearly 20% over the last year.
Over the last year. So if the new intensification of or extension of stop and search carries on, I know it's speculation, but you would presumably hope that that would well, we want it to go, don't we, obviously, but you would hope that that will go, that will increase that amount, that decline, is it
Well, I
not?
want to see all knife crime,
Yeah.
all knife crime, you know,
No, I'm trying to be realistic, you know,
yeah,
I mean,
significantly decrease. We would like to see that 20% reduction, in, you know, the reduction, sounds strange, a reduction increase. We want a larger reduction. Also, clearly, the number of murders that are taking place, we really want to see a significant reduction in that. Would hope that the level of activity by the Met at the moment out there, not just with the Violent Crime Task Force, but across the piece, across the whole of the Metropolitan Police and their focus on violence, will bring those figures down, which means that, as we know, it's not the figures, it's those people and communities that are affected, so that we can start to feel that, the community can start to feel the improvements.
I see. Deputy Commissioner, if I could just ask you again, just to go back a little bit, you sort of have mentioned, when you are engaging with people in a local community, has the reaction on the whole been that people are in favour of greater stop and search powers? Are they, in other words, reassured? Are they pleased? Because there seems to be, when we've had various witnesses here before us, people might have qualms about some things, but on the basic, they seem to think it's got to be there. And I just wondered what the reaction was amongst communities to the increase recently.
So I think what communities want is to be confident that their police service are there to protect them and will use the tools that they are given under law to protect the communities. Quite clearly, some people will see stop and search as intrusive and challenging for them. My personal experience talking to people across London, including the victims' families, is one where they want more stop and search. But they want quality stop and search. They want stop and search done professionally and where possible, and I'm being realistic here, where possible with courtesy. I want my officers, and the Commissioner has been very clear, she wants her officers to act professionally at all times. They do face a lot of difficulties on the streets on occasions. We know the assault numbers are far too high. 70 officers a week at least being assaulted across the Metropolitan Police area. That's too high. So there is difficulty out there and some confrontations. But I believe strongly that the vast majority of law-abiding public want to see crime down and safety up. And if that means more stop and search, then I think they support that, so long as it's done by a professional organisation, which I believe it is.
What more can you do, do you think, in the long term? What more can you do you think, to engage and reassure, you know, and be effective? I mean, what more can you do?
It's a simple answer to that. If the government gives us 6,000 extra police officers out of the 20,000 that they've promised,
okay,
then we will put more officers onto the street.
Yeah.
We will have a greater police presence on the street. We can reinforce our dedicated ward officers, our local community officers. We can re-establish where they're broken. And there are many, many strong community links, but where they've faded through loss of numbers of police officers, we can re-establish those. And we can improve the safety on the streets for Londoners. But we need more police officers to do that. We need 6,000 more police officers to do that.
Yeah. Fair point. Something quite specific here, if I can ask of you both. I mean, the Home Office launched a consultation on draft guidance in relation to the operation and application of the new knife crime prevention orders.
Yeah.
What are your views on how this approach can steer people away from crime, knife crime and serious crime? What are your views on that?
So I don't think it's any secret that some of our officers had a lot to do with the development of this proposal. And I know the officer personally, and I know that his pure intention behind the developing of this thinking was as a preventative measure. And it was based on feedback that he was getting from communities where they were saying, look, we know so-and-so is carrying a knife or is hanging around with the wrong people. What do we do about that? What do we do with that information? Because, you know, we don't want them criminalised. We don't want them thrown into a criminal justice system. We want them stopped from carrying a knife, and we want them stopped from associating with the wrong sort of people and doing activity which is going to drag them into the criminal justice system. And that's where the knife crime prevention order comes from, really, which is to try to spot that potential early and put constraints on the individual's behaviour to try and guide them away from behaviour which will end up criminalising them. And that's where we are at the moment. Now, we don't see it applying to huge numbers of people, but we do see it as a quality measure which we can be optimistic about, trying to avoid criminalising youngsters who don't need to be criminalised.
Yeah. In that connection, Deputy Mayor, you did a campaign, was it 2 years ago or 1 year ago? The one, London Needs You Alive, you know the video. We're talking about ways of tackling knife crime over and above stop and search. Do you count that as success?
London Needs You Alive wasn't a one-off campaign, it's still continuing, and I'm sure you've seen posters, and we're still continuing working with schools around London Needs You Alive. It was to a specific group, it was a specific group of those that may be, you know, on the periphery of carrying knives and trying to do some preventative messaging. We certainly have had a really good reach. I haven't got the figures in front of me, but we have had very good reach from the London Needs You Alive. You know, millions of people viewing it and being seeing the campaign. I mean, overall, the success of the campaign and the success of all the measures will be seen when we have significantly reduced and we've stabilised, you know, continue to reduce violence in London. That is beginning, you know, absolutely no complacency, and I'm not saying it's because of the London Needs Your Life campaign. It's a combination of all the tactics, police tactics, and it's not just stop and search. It's all the other tactics that are going into from the Metropolitan Police to suppress violence. So you know, you're right in terms of, you're absolutely, you know, within the right to ask specific questions. We've got to see this across the piece with everything that we're doing, setting up the violence reduction unit, public health approach. The London Needs Your Life campaign is a small part of that.
Public health approach seems to have gone into the shadows a bit.
Well, it hasn't here in City Hall. You know, certainly some of the pronouncements from the new government have been very much focusing purely on enforcement and the public, you know, public stance on that. Here, you know, the public health approach is absolutely live and well, and for me, and it always has been, is that public health approach is absolutely about enforcement, arresting people and taking those off the streets that are going to cause violence, but also putting in place those projects and programmes for early intervention and prevention, working with schools, working with communities and working with families. Yeah, the public health approach is very much making progress here.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, before I bring in Senator O'Connor, I should say that as a constituency assembly member, I do actually get the Section 60 advance notices, which obviously helps.
Yeah, thank you. Too quick. I was going to amplify that. Your point is a good one. Only yesterday I was on an email trail, probably down towards the bottom of the 70 odd, but it even reaches down to me. And the Croydon and Sutton and Bromley is very effective. The emails go out, Section 60 is considered, it's relayed, and then a goal group meeting as necessary. Which is one of my points. Question I've got here is again, we had 3 serious stabbing events on night before last, Section 60. I wanted to understand about the resources. So the resource implications of granting Section 60, because there are more of them. They're not used sparingly, but I understand that, and there's a question around that later. How does a declaration of a 60 impact on the resources of, say, a Croydon Boku? The more people pulled away, Steve.
So the whole point, I know we've discussed this in the past, the whole point about a Section 60 is to publicise it and to try to damp down any future problem through increased police presence on the street and searching without the suspicion that's required for a pace search. So it does need extra resourcing. But if you think about it, we put a Section 60 in place in anticipation of or in immediately following a violent incident. Well, the violent incident itself will attract more resources.
Indeed, yeah.
So almost certainly, well, if we're dealing with a homicide, for example, which we are tragically sometimes, then you will have immediately deployed into the BCU assets from outside the BCU, right. Typically the Violent Crime Task Force, and almost certainly the Territorial Support Group, and officers from Dog Support Unit, etc., will come into the BCU from other parts of London, and then they will have the awareness that there's a Section 60 in place, and you can carry out Section 60 stop and searches. So the two sort of go hand in glove, really. If you get the Section 60, it's because of the violent incident, and if you have a violent incident, you're going to get more resources anyway.
Okay, that's right. My last point, the brief point, is about the engagement with communities. My experience in my patch has been good, but my concern, I think is shared by others, is about the BOCUs, is about the borough mergers, and the fact that those very good officers who have specialisms around engagement, and there are some very good ones out there, are increasingly spread very thinly. And I think if we're there to encourage engagement with the communities around this issue and others, I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that they are spread very thinly, and that is an issue, placing almost to one side the extra 6,000 officers you're going to get, because this is a specialism. There's some very good chief inspectors. I've got a very good one down there, and I think that's something you would need to be aware of to make sure that those communities are engaged. These are evening meetings, going out to meet people, and often they're spread very thinly. And I just wanted to put that one down there for you to really to think about. I'll probably leave it at that, Chair, if I may.
Sure. Just very quickly, can we call an engagement with the Commissioner around Section 60, and in particular when they were issued on a borough-wide basis? And I can understand, as a supporter of stop and search, effective stop and search, why that may happen, but the high numbers and the disproportional arrangements between high volume, high crime areas, if I can describe them like that, might not be, or high incident areas, was still an issue. Do you know what I mean? Can you tell us what discussions have gone on about the appropriate of that, and to avoid, I mean, let's put the cards on the table. I think some of the problems that brought stop and search into disrepute in the past has been some lazy way of policing issues. So, you know, I'm not saying that all Section 60s borough-wide or BOCU-wide are a lazy way. They may well be an appropriate way considering the incident. But if it's a high number, that clearly must indicate, hold on, what's going on here? And are you, in terms of management, being intrusive and holding people to account to saying, well, why is that happening? And what were those incidents that led to that borough-wide sanction?
So Commander Dave Musker, up until very recently, he's swapped roles now, but he was the lead on stop and search and holds a regular meeting that is intrusive into stop and search. It looks at exactly the issues you've raised. How many are we doing? Where are they being done? How many Section 60s are authorised? When? Where? And what's the area that they're covering? And if they're covering a borough, or even wider than a borough, is that simply, oh, it's just easy to write on the authorisation a borough? Or is there a reason? Because, as we've discussed in this venue before, sometimes you get very narrow Section 60s, and people go, well, that's good. Observers will say, that's good, that's being surgical and professional, and therefore a borough-wide Section 60, that must be lazy. I don't think it's as easy as that, if I may say so. I know you're not saying that.
I'm not saying that.
But I want to just reinforce.
But there are not, in terms of numbers and statistics.
Yeah, it's not laziness, I think, in most cases. I'm not saying in every case. That's why we have an oversight group headed by a commander to look at it, to make sure that we stay on our toes and we stay professional. But every time that I've asked about why was there a borough-wide one, there has been a reason why there's been a borough-wide. Because some gangs operate in a narrow area and some gangs operate more widely, and sometimes it's, well, that gang's fighting with that gang and it's the whole borough, and sometimes it needs to be cross-borough and not defined by local authority. I think it's the question of
the numbers of it. And the last time we looked at those numbers, it did look a little bit strange. And I'm hoping some work was undertaken following that conversation that we had in this forum at the time. But I'm glad to hear that you're asking those questions, because that's important to me.
So Jane Connors will be taking over from Dave Musker, and I anticipate will take over that role, and I'm quite confident she will be as intrusive as Dave has been in his time holding the reins.
Okay, fine. In which case we move on to a set of questions around Operation Midland, to be led by you, Steve.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Questions initially to St Stephen. The background of Operation Midland, I believe, is well known. And I really want to move to initially introduce the review, Sir Henrik's review, acknowledging 43 failings on the investigation into the claims, and his criticisms around the fact that it should have been abandoned earlier, the claimant was believed for far too long, and it shouldn't have been announced at an early stage that he was believed to be a credible and true witness, or claimant, I should say. Can you explain initially, Sir Stephen, how things could have gone so badly wrong in this? Your initial response.
I can try to address that issue. I can reassure, or try to reassure, hopefully, that I have here a spreadsheet of the 25 recommendations from the Henriquez report, and I have a list of the 43 failings which he found. I would say that you shouldn't add that up and create a total out of those two numbers, because many of the 43 failings actually feed into recommendations.
No, we're used to that sort of vernacular in this building, so I'll be asking about the actual recommendations specifically.
Okay, all right. So how did it happen, I think, is basically what you're asking. So how we believe it happened, and how, and we accept the report's findings. This was a particular time where there were a large number of complainants coming forward alleging sexual abuse, historic sexual abuse. The police service and the Metropolitan Police Service had come under significant criticism for not taking victims seriously. In many cases, not taking victims seriously because we found that what they said was inconsistent, and that they remembered things wrongly, and that was seen historically as a reason to not accept what they say as being true. And conscious of that, I believe that the inquiry team looked at what the complainant was saying and accepted that there were inconsistencies in what the person said, bearing in mind he was going back many, many years to what he professed were hugely traumatic, violent sexual situations. It was wrong, and the Commissioner has admitted and said that it was wrong to accept what Nick Beach said as credible and true. I think I would say, therefore, there was an overcompensation, perhaps by officers, into believing what he said, and probably less questioning and intrusion. And certainly Sir Richard Henriquez's report says that the officers should have been far more sceptical and intrusive in their questioning of the individual. And had they been, they may well have come to a conclusion that he was lying to them, as indeed he clearly was. But there were reasons why. I think it's been looked at by a number of groups. It's certainly been looked at in depth by police complaints bodies, first the PCC and now the new body, and they've found that yes, the officers made mistakes, but if asked did the officers do anything unprofessional or illegal, the answer is no. They found that the officers have no case to answer in relation to that.
I will interrupt you just briefly. The mistakes that they made caused massive emotional suffering to families, and the Met are the subject of significant compensation claims as a result. And so to say, yes, mistakes were made, and that's kind of it, and that's okay, without even interviewing the officers involved, I think...
With respect, I'm not saying that's it and that's okay.
Right. The IOPC may have said that. I'm not putting the words in your mouth. But anyway, let's if we may continue with it, because your point was a good one. It was made in the context of post, I don't know, Savile, etc., where there was criticism of the way that there was dealings with previous offences. But is that a reason indeed to kind of go right to the other end of the spectrum? Okay, is that professional to say we didn't deal with those well, so we should be rather more credulous about fresh applications, because your quote, never always believe quotes in newspapers, of course, but it's not to. Operation Midland, which is what you've just said, Operation Midland was carried out against a backdrop of intense scrutiny and allegations that in the past the Met had covered up sensitive allegations about prominent people. So you took that hit at that time, but surely that's no reason for your officers to then go to the other end of the spectrum and actually say, right, we'll get ourselves in a place where there's an obligation of innocent people to prove themselves not guilty, as opposed to as law and equity dictates the other way round. Do you feel that many officers would bounce into going completely the wrong end of the spectrum and being far too credulous and believing of accusations?
Well, I think that's what I was trying to say.
Oh, you accept that? Oh, okay. Right.
I accept that because of criticism that we had failed to investigate properly, that officers may have overcompensated and could have been more forensic in their questioning of the complainant when he came forward. And if they had been, then they may well have discovered earlier that actually what he was saying was not true. And as you quite rightly pointed out, and maybe I was remiss, ruined the lives of a number of people, for which we have apologised. I have apologised. The Commissioner at the time has apologised. And we are in discussion with the three principal people that we're talking about to let them see how we are moving forward with the Henriquez report and how we're dealing with the learning lessons from that report. So we are trying to, as well as apologise, make amends to the people for the damage we've done to their lives, because we know we have. I'm sorry if I don't sound passionate enough. I can assure you I am. We made mistakes, and it has damaged people's lives and people who've given a huge amount of public service over decades to the United Kingdom. And we are uniquely aware of that. I chair a diamond group of very senior people who look at this. We've met virtually every week for the past 6 weeks on this, and we agonise over everything that's been done here. The Met made mistakes. But I also have to say to you, I've met the officers involved in the investigation, and I do have to maintain the line. Yes, mistakes were made. They made mistakes. They acknowledged that they made mistakes, but they didn't do it maliciously, and they didn't do it in any way, I believe, criminally. And IOPC, having looked at it, comes to the same conclusion.
Okay. Going on, we mentioned the review with 25 recommendations, and you say that these are subject of your goal group, and I hear that you're looking at changing, and perhaps you'll clarify that, changing the way that the Met will deal with these sort of cases, and I'd like to hear your thoughts around that. What would be rather good is that bodies like ourselves will be able to scrutinise you in how you are proceeding with acting on these recommendations. That's a bit difficult because the Commissioners refused to publish the redacted report.
Sorry, that's not true. So we have already published a redacted report, and we will, in due course, publish another report with even less redactions. But the report that we will publish in due course will have redactions based on a very few number of things. One will be that the content is graphic and grossly sexually offensive and disturbing, and we won't publish that sort of language. We won't publish details of addresses that will impact people who live in those addresses. Have got nothing to do with this.
That's obvious. I mean, I get that, but it's about the recommendations wouldn't be specific about individuals. It'd be how you'll be changing the way the organisation deals with it.
So what I'm trying to explain is what we are redacting. So we're redacting grossly offensive, we're redacting addresses, and we will redact a very, very small number of other details about people who don't need to be known to the public. Apart from that, the whole report will be published.
Will be published. We'll be able to see the full recommendations. Yes. And I understand completely about the redacted detail. I mean, that's a kind of given. We get that. But we would want to see what the recommendations are, how you're getting on with proceeding with them, so that this won't be repeated. I think that'll be me for the moment, Chair.
Yeah. Yes. Initially, I'd like to ask about the redactions of you, First Deputy Mayor. In November, when this was raised with the Mayor immediately after the report was published, the Mayor said he hadn't read the whole report, but you had read the whole report at that time. Well, firstly, can I ask you, do you believe that the number of redactions that have been made, because I understand you read the report which was entirely as it had been written by Sir Richard, did you think there should be substantial redactions
So this is...
when you read it?
Yeah, I mean, I remember being questioned about this by yourselves at PCC quite soon afterwards. The advice, I mean, I did read it, and the advice I was given that the redactions were ones that were necessary at that time. But now that, I mean, I think it's 2 years ago, isn't it, that was happened. Now we've got through the trial of Carl Beach. That's why the Met are now going through the report to see what redactions can now be unredacted and that can be. And I know that the stance that's being taken now is to publish as much as to take the stance that everything should be published unless there is a very, very good reason not to. Now, clearly, 2 years ago, there was still ongoing investigations, and there was still the trial of Carl Beach, and I was given advice that those redactions were the redactions that were necessary.
Yes. You see, I've got the comments in front of me made by Sir Richard Henriques at the end of last month when he said, "I am racking my brains trying to think of what possible covert methodology they are referring to. There were no secret bugs or undercover officers. If you consider the length of time between the alleged offences and the investigations, which was more than 30 years, what possible covert tactics could they be talking about?" Are you saying, Sir Steve, that those things are going to be published, which Sir Richard says that you have refused to publish?
So we're going to not publish graphic sexual violence,
yes,
and in detail, when it is horrific. We're not going to publish some addresses that will identify locations that have nothing to do with the situation, and we're not going to publish some names of people who have got nothing to do with the case. Apart from that, everything will be published.
Okay, I'm pleased to hear that. You have effectively said that the IPCC or its successor have pretty much cleared your officers because saying they weren't malicious and so on. What I want to put to you is that maybe they were incompetent. For example, Lords Britain and Bramall, at the time of these offences, they were in alleged offences. They were in public life. Chances are they were under surveillance by police, security officers and people of that kind, former Home Secretary, former Chief of the General Staff.
I think that's a stretch, if I may say so.
All right, but let me progress. Okay. But whatever, they were in public life. They would have had full diaries, not "it rained this morning," but it was would have been hour by hour, in place by place. And it has been shown in the reports that dates and places produced by the man Beach could easily have been refuted if these diaries had been referred to immediately. I would have thought, and I suggest to you, that really at a very elementary level, those sort of things could be checked, irrespective of false memory and things of that kind, which you have already referred to. Don't you think that showed a lack of competence?
So I think, again, I don't want to appear glib, but it's difficult to get past. Mistakes were made in the investigation.
Yes.
We should have been more questioning of the allegations that were made. there were inconsistencies in what Carl Beach said, and all this has been pointed out by Henriques and accepted by the Metropolitan Police Service. And as a result, the lives of a number of important and very dedicated public servants was very badly damaged. But a number of people looked at the investigation as it was progressing. And I believe if they'd thought the investigation was incompetent, it would have been stopped at an earlier point. I do have to go back to the fact that we were working in a particular time, and I think I said in reference to previous questioning, was there an overcompensation as a result of previous errors? I think that's a fairly good way of looking at it. Were his allegations believed straight away and not questioned? Yes, they were believed, and they should have been questioned more. But I'm not convinced that incompetent is the word that I would use to describe what the officers did.
Well, I put it to you, Deputy Commissioner, that anyone who has looked at this, and of course hindsight is a wonderful thing, but the sort of things, and I imagine that these officers who looked at this had been to Hendon and had done all the police work and so on, really very elementary things were not done, like, for example, interviewing the principals at a very early stage, interrogating things like diaries, official lists of engagements and things of that sort, and had that ordinary pedestrian police work, which I would have imagined would have been done at a very low level, had that been carried out, the thing would have been knocked on the head straight away. And that's why I put the charge of incompetence to you. Are you not willing to accept that at all?
I don't accept that the officers were incompetent.
I'm not saying that they were incompetent, I'm saying that what they did was incompetent.
Okay, I'm not sure I see the difference, but...
It's angels dancing on the head of a pin. You see, what I want to do is, Deputy, I want to link it with the fact that in the MOPAC report, which has just been published, which we've just seen a summary of, public satisfaction, overall satisfaction with policing is at its lowest level. And I want to suggest to you that one of the reasons might possibly be the things which have emerged since the publication of the Henriques report, which does appear to show a very high level, and that's why I'm using the word incompetence in policing. And I don't want to say it's made you a laughing stock, but some of the things which police apparently did not do, which I think ordinary members of the public might think ought to have been done and would have been very sensible, were not done, and that there was clearly very limited oversight of this. Do you think that there might possibly be a link of the kind that I have drawn between public perception of policing and the way that this matter has been handled?
I think inevitably public confidence is driven by a number of different things, sometimes by people's personal experience and sometimes by what they read in the media and see on television. So I think undeniably what you say will have an element of truth in it, that officers seem to be acting in this way, making mistakes, inquiries being criticised so heavily and doing damage to people that shouldn't have been damaged is bound to make people have some sort of thought about that. Equally, when we have events such as the terrorist attacks in 2017, where officers respond so brilliantly and professionally, when officers are injured on duty regularly trying to protect the public, when officers are killed on duty trying to protect the public, when we run events like the Notting Hill Carnival, which frankly is one of the biggest policing operations in the UK, certainly, almost certainly in Europe and around the world, when we run events like the visit of Trump, it said, what I'm trying to, I know you're shaking your head, but the reality is they're also influenced by the professionalism and the bravery and the dedication of the 40,000 people in the Metropolitan Police Service. So to say that an incident like this will damage it, of course it has an impact, but lots of things have
This
an
was a
impact.
very, Deputy, this was a very egregious incident. You know, I'm old enough to remember people, though I don't remember them myself, remember people talking about the Keystone Cops. But the way this thing has been dealt with does appear to be like that. And we expect police to show the kind of devotion that they have shown in the incidents that you have just related to us to happen as an everyday event, part of the high standards of the MPS. But in this particular incident, the standards have fallen really very low indeed. And I know you've accepted that, and I've got your statement here and so on. But it has had this knock-on effect. And I want to relate this to another thing. You pursued this case, and the MPS pursued this case really very rigorously over a very long period of time. They pursued it very publicly indeed on what has emerged to have been absolutely no real evidence at all for this. And I wonder whether or not there is a different standard of evidence used in this kind of matter than, shall we say, for example, the allegations which have been made about the conduct of events in Tower Hamlets, where I see that this week you have decided to not to pursue many of the allegations, or rather the city police have decided to pursue many of the allegations which have been made, I think through you, i.e. through the MPS. And I would like to suggest to you that there is infinitely more evidence in these matters which have been raised at Tower Hamlets than were ever raised here. And yet the one thing was pursued extremely rigorously with these terrible outcomes, and the other appears not to have been done very rigorously. Do the MPS take a view on how they're going to pursue cases and with what rigour they're going to do it, and whether or not they're going to do it in the sort of public glare which this matter was dealt with?
I'm not really sure what you're asking, if I'm honest with you.
What
I
I'm
don't want
suggesting
to
is
volunteer an answer.
That the MPS is selective in the level of evidence that they're going to take on board before they pursue an investigation rigorously. So I'm suggesting that in this case, so far as we can tell, there was no evidence, and I'm suggesting that common sense might have told you that there was little evidence, whereas, for example, in Tower Hamlets there's been mountains, which to us, we're lay people, we don't investigate these matters, of evidence, and the thing hasn't been pursued.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to compare one investigation to another, but let me just go back and say, yes, I've accepted that mistakes were made in the investigation in Operation Midland, but I go back to the allegations that were made were of the most serious order imaginable, including years of sexual abuse, including homicide. So these are allegations that had to be looked at, and they had to be taken seriously, and they had to have an investigation around them, and that's what's happened. You know, you've raised something there which is, well, why didn't the officers sit down with the complainants at an early stage? Well, because we don't do that. Because you carry out the investigation and gather the evidence. And when you've got evidence and sufficient evidence, that's when you go and speak to to the victims. Sorry, to the alleged perpetrators of the offence. You don't interview them early on to ask them what their views are. In most cases, that comes towards the back end of it. I just don't think you can take one set of cases and compare it to another. There was oversight of Operation Midland. There was reviews of Operation Midland to look at what was being done and why it was being done. And the investigation did last a long time. The allegations were incredibly serious. We know, dropped the ball on allegations as serious previously and let people down that way. So we decided that we would pursue this to make sure that we followed what we thought was a genuine complainant. Did we get that wrong? Yes, we did. But I don't think you can link that to another investigation and say, is there some sort of
Well,
relationship going on here?
I'm a representative of the public. I wonder why you do this, take this line of action in one case where there appears to be no evidence, and you say there were serious allegations. I think many people would say they were so preposterous.
Well, there appears to be no evidence now. There didn't appear to be no evidence then.
The phrase common sense is one answer. It's just one final thing I want to
Phrase
ask in
hindsight is
relation to
coming to my
this. And this is the cost. This is the financial cost to the
Right.
MPS and to the public purse. I think the figure that has been published is it's cost £2.5 million. Now, does that include all of the legal costs? Does that include the compensation that Mr. Beach received? In other words, is this the total cost which is going to be attributed to the public purse? I'm not talking about the cost of this man being in prison or anything like that, in bringing the case. Is the £2.5 million the final figure?
I don't know what it includes. I'd have to go away and write to you about that. And when you say the compensation to Beach, you mean the criminal injury compensation?
That's right.
Well, that's not.
Well, it fell on the
That's
public.
not coming from our
but
budget.
it did fall
so,
on the public purse, of course.
You know, that was about £23,000. I don't think that doesn't come from our budget. That comes from another budget.
Okay. Well,
I'm happy to write to you and tell you what's in there.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
I'll just finish on that. That was a point I was just going to try to helpfully finish on, because it'd be good if you can write to us, because there's the published £2.5 million cost to the Met, but apparently Northumbria Police carried out 900,000 plus cost that was charged to the Met. As a result of it, that was another mill on it. We've obviously paid out money already on compensation. There's a very significant claim heading down the way. So, very significant cost, which is as a result of, in your words, mistakes made early on. We all aspire, what could that have paid for? You aspired earlier 6 hours next to police. This could rise to whatever figure you write to us about, 4 million upward, who knows? We'll hear about that. Now, no one here is a greater champion of the officers than people around this horseshoe, and particularly myself. But if you're in another organisation and you made clear mistakes that cost that organisation millions of pounds, and also had a reputational effect on that organisation. The Met Police is the most professional, wonderful police service in the world, but this has had a reputational effect on the Met Police. Is it right that those officers were able to then, sold them, made a mistake, and that was the end of it? Now, I'm not asking for scapegoats, and I'm not asking for anything unreasonable, but it does seem that the balance of sanction against those significant mistakes seems to have been kind of put to one side. Do you want to comment on that, Steve?
Only to say that the investigation, so Richard did his report, and one of the main issues that he said was this needs to be referred to the IOPC. It was referred to the IOPC, who are responsible for the investigation of the things we're talking about, and they have come back and said that the officers acted in good faith, got things wrong, badly wrong, with horrible implications for people, but they acted in good faith.
Right. Okay.
And it's therefore difficult for our organisation, with the code of ethics that we have for our people, which is that when they make mistakes, that they do so in good faith, they will be supported. If they make mistakes and it's malicious, or they do something malicious, then we will deal with them, and they will be dealt with either by ourselves or the IOPC. But I think this falls into a category of people who were trying to do their job.
Yes.
They made mistakes, they got things wrong. And I think to say that they are responsible for the millions of pounds of public expenses is difficult. They are cogs in a machine, and the investigation of this size costs money.
And I have great sympathy for those officers at that level doing so, but they're not just cogs in the machine. They're in a very hierarchical organisation that probably there is pressure from not pressure from above, but there are more senior officers reflecting on Savile, reflecting on that actually we need to do more. Not necessarily those officers on the ground. I think it's best I just leave it there, Chair.
Well, that's the point. I don't think you should leave it there, because we're concentrating on the people on the front line doing a difficult job and making some judgment calls in terms of very complex cases. But the whole issue around Enriquez, if I remember reading the report, and I did ask the question of the former commissioner I thought the gaps in the report were more interesting than what it was worth. And it goes back to, and I do think there is a problem within the Met about the checker, who's doing the checking in that hierarchical situation, who is being intrusive enough, who has got that additional experience to say, actually, that's not going anywhere, or when I've read that, that doesn't correspond to that. And I think that was the bit that was missing. And Enrique avoids that completely. He doesn't look at the people that were overseeing the investigation. And then we get to this real problem. I hope the learning lessons will be in the hierarchical situation is when should senior officers intervene in someone's investigation to say, actually, you need to look at that and you need to do that. The whole issue of supervision was somewhat, I thought, lacking. And it got to a point of where the commissioner was brought into disrepute because he must have been briefed by somebody to go onto the public airways to defend a crucial aspect of the investigation when it was quite clear, what we know today, great with hindsight, that there were concerns about the evidence that he got, that actually, no, this is all going hunky-dory and going in the right position. And that's the bit. So in the learning lessons, is there a conversation? Is there an honest conversation and a clarity about that of the checkers, of overseeing the people that are doing the frontline work, about saying, actually, this doesn't feel right here, and we need you to either go back on that, or actually, it's not your call. We think you've done enough. We need to. This is where it's gone. There's nothing. It's not going any further.
Okay.
Because that was missing in that report, I thought, in terms of.
I've read the Henriquez report
Yeah.
several times now,
There was some names missing.
and there's frequent reference to deputy assistant commissioners.
I was thinking a bit higher.
Right. Okay. Well.
There were names missing. I wonder what they were there for.
Right.
I know what they should be doing, but in terms of how it works in your hierarchy, but they weren't included in that report.
Right. Well, let me say in the Metropolitan Police Service of today under Cressida, the focus is on operations and performance, and with her background in investigation, both serious crime and counter-terrorism, and her record of command, she emphasises to us a very hands-on, intrusive style of leadership, which I think is the right approach. I believe I'm an effective part of that. I think all of Management Board takes its responsibility to be intrusive and to lead very seriously. There are many things with hindsight, because we all use hindsight, which would not happen today, that happened in relation to Operation Midland. But that is because we learned lessons from Operation Midland, not because we are better than the people that were there then. Simply because we have the benefit of their experience and we have the benefit of hindsight.
And Chair, just finally, I think that's what people need to understand, but in terms of how those learning lessons are put into practice, because I do believe you can learn from hindsight about some of those situations, I do get the issues around the new victims in this case. Do you know what I mean? In terms of that were dealt with, but there's an issue in other places where the Met has made mistakes. It's usually it's no further action. We're quite clear that these individuals weren't. The evidence has led that they weren't party to this. So I think there are some issues. I'm conscious of that. In terms of the Management Board, I'm quite clear about. You probably know. You're clear in terms of what the Commissioner's lead approach is. But is the rest of the organisation and that hierarchy there? Because all too often, I'm not saying we have Operation Midland mistake type areas, because that seems on a mega scale, but all too often you see lack of intrusive management or lack of proper supervision in certain circumstances, and that just doesn't lead to effective policing. And how do we keep that throughout the Met? How do people understand their different roles in terms of that supervision isn't about actually you people getting on with that because I'm at this level and I don't need to do that and I don't want to interfere in what you're doing, but there is a right to interfere, to be honest. I just want to be clear that it's throughout the organisation, not just at the top.
Well, so the different opinion I have from you, Len, is that it has to start at the top. Otherwise, it doesn't work at all. There. And I can assure you, it does exist at the top of the organisation, and I do believe it filters through the rest of the organisation. Is it true everywhere? Is it true in every operation and every incident? No, it's not. Do we get to some things later than we want to? Yes, we do. Do we sometimes miss things? Inevitably, with a city this size, with its population and its busyness, we do miss things. But I genuinely believe that the approach taken by the Commissioner and by Management Board and by the people that work so closely with us is one of intrusion, is one of leadership, and is one of, look, I'm not saying this is wrong, but prove to me that we're doing this right, and that we are taking into account everything we should be taking into account. What are the views of the community? Are we looking after the victims properly, etc., etc. I think that's the meat and drink of our day job, Len.
Thank you. I noticed that the Victims Commissioner, Claire Wexman, is with us now. Would you like to come downstairs to join the panel? So we'll move on. Sorry. So we move on to the next set of questions, which is around rape and sexual offences. And before I hand over to Assembly Patient, can I thank you, Claire, for writing to us and offering to come and to come to this committee. It's much appreciated. Thank you. Caroline.
Thank you very much. Maybe I should start with you, Victims Commissioner. Claire, thank you so much for coming along today. Obviously, the London Rape Review was published, it was the end of July. Do you want to talk us through your reaction to that and your set of recommendations you have made from that?
So just to give it some context, I felt we needed to do a real deep dive into rape cases in London, from listening to victims and survivors, many struggling to access justice and support, and we were seeing a real drop in charges and conviction rates, so really to get a better picture as to what was happening in London. So this has been one of the most comprehensive reviews to date. I know the government are doing their own end-to-end review, but we've done an incredibly comprehensive review for London, has given us the clearest picture to date of how rape victims are treated through the justice process. So the research team went back to April 2016 and took that month, and there were over 500 allegations of rape to the police, and then tracked those cases through the system to really see what was driving attrition, why were there reasons why victims might be withdrawing from the system, or why we weren't getting the charging rates and conviction rates that we had hoped. There were over 146 different variables coded for that research, so we're covering the entire case progression. 84% of that 501 were classed as crimes. I want to briefly, just if I may, pick up from obviously the last conversation, but from what this review showed us is that there is a misplaced belief, false allegations are rare. There were only 14 cases out of that 501 that were seen to be false allegations. So just wanted to kind of put that out there as well. What we then saw was 58%, very high rate of victims and survivors withdrawing from the process. And that's incredibly troubling, and something that we need to really look at and understand more fully what's driving that. And that's what this review did. So really understanding why victims were feeling they had to come out of the system. And that's around not feeling that they were they were given, first of all, sort of up-to-date information, and that really reflects a lot of the findings from my Victims Code of Practice review that I did earlier this year about just not getting regular updates and information. And when you're in a state of trauma and going through that, it's really important to be kept updated, otherwise people will give up and will leave the system and come out. Accessing support, absolutely vital for victims, and especially for rape victims. feeling that they weren't accessing the right type of support. There were wait lists, obviously, for getting in for ISVAs or getting into counselling, and being deterred from counselling as well, which is a critical issue. If we look at how long these cases are taking, so the review showed from time of report to the outcome of court was on average 18 months. Well, that's April 2016. I can assure you that figure will be much worse now post the Liam Allen and all the issues around disclosure. So if you can imagine a victim not being able to access counselling and therapeutic services or being dissuaded from doing so, it's a very long time to stay in limbo and stay in a state of trauma and not get the right treatment for that. So it's another reason why victims felt they had to make a choice at the end about whether they prioritise their emotional well-being or whether they prioritise justice. Obviously disclosure and around the need for looking at third-party material. It didn't pick up so much on the phones because that was April 2016, but the third-party material, which is police often have to ask for social services records, medical records, school records, and there's a delay in actually getting that from councils, from social services, and that causes a huge delay in the system, and that's another reason why victims often feel they come out of the system as a result of that. So there were a number of very complex but interrelated issues as to why victims felt they had to withdraw, and I think what this review has done is sort of change that misconception that often I have heard from police and CPS that would say, well, look, victims don't support the investigation or they don't support the prosecution. And actually there are real reasons as to why they're coming out. So it's not necessarily a case of not supporting the investigation or the prosecution. There are critical issues as to why they feel they need to withdraw from the process. And so I made a number of recommendations to try and tackle that area in particular. And that would involve the Met and the CPS and obviously recommendations to the government as well. And then there's an area around NFA, so no further action, was 29% police were NFAing. And very interestingly, what was amongst that that we've been able to identify were that police were often using, they're seeing inconsistencies in the victim's account. They would NFA on the back of that. What this research has really pushed forward is taking some leading research from Canada about the neurobiological impact of trauma on memory. And so there's actual evidence to show why victims and survivors could present in this way with inconsistencies. It's not a case necessarily that they are lying and that they're not credible. It is actually the impact of trauma. But this makes the job incredibly complex because, again, picking up on the last discussion,
exactly.
How do police then, identify who is a genuine victim and who isn't? So I don't envy how difficult that job is, but the recommendations around really pushing this research and this trauma-informed understanding and the way that the police are questioning victims, interviewing them, even the way that they're getting support, is absolutely critical. So I'm really hopeful, and I know that the Met are very supportive of this recommendation, as are the CPS. The CPS have admitted that in their charging decisions, they too will look at the inconsistencies and based on that will not charge. And so it's for them also, they've agreed to do training to understand more fully this impact of trauma on the memory and how it presents in victims. But it's very, very complex and difficult work to do. But I think this review has really pushed that forward more than anything else ever before, to really put a context around why victims have inconsistencies in their accounts and how best to support them to get the right evidence. It also talked about some procedural, so things that we could make improvements around VRI. So we see that less victims withdraw, less cases fall if there's a VRI. So again, it's making sure that those are offered. We were seeing victims not take those VRIs, and again, through talking to victims, they said they really didn't understand what the process was. They didn't feel they had the right support in that environment. So that's quite, I hope, easier to address, that if the police have got the right people doing it, takes skilled people doing those interviews and making sure the victims understand that process and that they have the right support in that process as well. That would make a big difference. Unfortunately, we didn't see, as I say, the charging rates had dropped. Only 6% proceeded to trial and only 3% resulted in a conviction. So it's a pretty bleak picture, although having said London is better than the rest of the country. That's, it's over 1% nationally. So even though that's not great. That's why the government are doing their end-to-end review. On a positive, the government have reached out to us. We're talking to them about this review, and the research team will be going in to actually go through the framework and how this research was done. The National Victims Commissioner has come forward in full support and is writing to all the PCCs on this research, hoping to get all PCCs, all the police forces, to do similar research, so we can really start to get a full national picture as well. So, yeah, it's a superb piece of work. I know the findings are not too positive, but there's a lot that's come out that I feel we can really work on to drive some change. But it is tricky work.
Thank you. There's one thing in there that I noticed around the issue of mental health. Was
Yes.
it sort of 41% of rape victims report mental health? Was that a surprise to you that came out? And what have you specifically recommended around that?
So that again came out and was very was indicated in police NFAing as well as around mental health. It's not a surprise. We do know that those with mental health issues, it makes them far more vulnerable to victimisation. We also know there's also a cycle, so we're seeing repeat victims. So there are victims within that 41% who are suffering from previous victimisation and therefore have been victimised again. And so it's almost a vicious circle for them. If you can imagine, they've been a rape victim, and didn't get justice or support, and then have been victimised again, and then their mental health is used against them to push them out of the system, so they're filtered out of the justice process.
You made any recommendations around mental health?
Yes, so again, it's around the training with police, around the trauma-informed training would pick that up as well. The Deputy Mayor has agreed to do a Justice Matters next month, because taking on some of these recommendations, it needs partners around the table to really to work a bit further and dig deeper into what these findings have shown. So the vulnerability and the mental health will be discussed at the Justice Matters as well, to really understand how best to address that. But it's all around identifying those needs and making sure victims are getting the right support for these complex needs, which is not happening as best as it should, and that's the issue.
Mayor, how are you responding to this review and then the recommendations that Claire has put forward, and what are you doing with the Met now to take this further forward?
Just to reiterate, it is a superb piece of work and analysis, and I think it's been an important piece of work in terms of taking forward the understanding. Everyone knew that there was a serious problem, but a real understanding about where along the system some of the problems were. Obviously, not all very few of the recommendations are for MOPAC, but there's significant recommendations for every bit of the criminal justice service. In terms of taking forward the recommendations, as Claire says, we're going to have a Justice Matters in a month's time, so that we have all partners around the table to really discuss the recommendations and how they might be taken forward. We've certainly had discussions via the London Crime Reduction Board and the sub-board below that myself and Steve House chair, around what do these recommendations mean, how can we take them forward, and what needs to be done. But in terms of my own role, in terms of the commissioning of services for victims, that's incredibly important. So we've taken on board before the publication of the report and through Claire's work reviewing the Victims Code of Practice, what was needed in terms of victim services. So the new Victims and Witness Service has services within that specifically for sexual violence. The extra money that the Mayor's put in, the £15 million for funding across the piece of violence against women and girls, has extra money in there for independent sexual violence advisors. I'm not suggesting that we're bridging the gap of what is needed, but we are beginning to provide extra services. And of course there is the extra money that has been put forward and has already gone out the door for rape crisis centres and the SARCs as well, because that's clearly, as Claire has already said, it is about the support that victims and survivors are getting. So we are doing our bit there, but there is just a difficulty in demand and these, in terms of the money that's going in. And just finally, we also commission Safer London for young women and girls, to have young people's advocates to give them that support as well, and one-to-one counselling and advice.
And will there be an action plan that comes out from your Justice Matters, so it's very clear how every agency is going to try to take forward these recommendations? I'm particularly thinking, how are you going to ensure the CPS acts on the findings of this review?
I hope that we'll have some clear actions and agreements as to how it's taken forward from different agencies. That's a question of convening and influencing and working together. Not that I have the ability to make them do an action plan, but certainly all partners around the table are absolutely aware of the recommendations and want to do their bit in making
you
a
can hold
difference
the
in
ring, that's part of the role
No, absolutely,
of this
and
place,
that's
so
what
you
we'll do.
can
Oh,
just...
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. We are not, we're not pushing against a shut door. All the partners want to make a difference here. The question is how and the best way of doing so.
So, in terms of the Met Police's response, Deputy Commissioner, how are you responding to this? Have you got an action plan? It seems things like the video recorded interview, things like that, some simple things that hopefully could help to lead to higher conviction rates.
So we think the report's a good piece of work. We've accepted it. Mark Simmons has written back to Claire in those terms, particularly interested in the trauma training that she's mentioned in detail in the report and here today. I think it highlights some of the issues we've been talking about earlier today in terms of victims' experiences, and frankly, being cutting to the chase, if we can get the best possible position for our officers who interview the victims and get as definitive as we can around what's happened and what we can take forward into the criminal justice system, then we're all in a far better place. So we're very strongly in favour of that and look forward to working on it. We're doing a lot in the area. I mean, just one figure that Claire mentioned, which I think just shows the difficulty of it. So 6% of who come forward go to court and 3% achieve convictions. Well, as you'll know, the CPS guidance is, one of their terms is, there's got to be a better than a 50% chance of conviction, and they're getting 50%. It's far higher in other crime categories. So all the way through the criminal justice system, we see challenges with this. It's exacerbated for us by two things at the moment, which we've discussed, one at length here, which is the digital issue. So much of the 18-month plus delay is around digital interrogation. And again, we are in the midst of a quite passionate debate about levels of intrusion. I've heard previous Attorney Generals talk about how there's a balance between privacy and the needs of justice, and the needs of justice will always outweigh privacy, in the words of a previous Attorney General, which gives you an indication of where the government was. It may not be where the government is now, but this is an ongoing dynamic in the country at the moment in terms of just how far back do you go. I acknowledge, because it's in the report, that we clearly need to look again at how specific we are in our analysis. So not just, and most importantly, to avoid overly distressing victims, but also in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. If we've got an 18-month plus delay, and it's because we're asking for that much forensic history from the digital devices, and actually we only need that much. But don't forget, of course, it's not just us as the police who will be asking for it will also be the CPS and the defence, possibly. So it's not simply a case of we're just going, well, give us all of it. There may be other pressures in there as well, but it's something we need to focus on. And the other one is the third-party material, and the fact that takes a long time to come back. And again, we need to be more specific in what we're asking for, and be certain in every case that we're asking for what is required and no more. But again, of course, CPS and defence may be asking for much broader. So there are lots of complexities within the criminal justice system that come to play here to elongate the process, and elongating the process, as we know, makes more people make the decision around getting on with my life and trying to recover from this, or justice. And I think too many feel, because of the length of the whole process and the ordeal they're having to go through again, it's just not worth it. And so they're not getting justice. So there's a lot that needs to be looked at, and there aren't quick fixes for a lot of those things, but in terms of activity, we are engaged with the national work. We've got our own work that's being led by Sean Thomas, looking at how the BCUs interact with the CPS to make sure that we are working as effectively as we can. We've set up a team to improve the quality of our files mainly around disclosure, to try to make sure that we're not overburdening people with disclosure. We've got a rape governance board in place, which is led by the head of profession for safeguarding. And rape performance is a standing item at Sue Williams' monthly meeting on safeguarding, to try to push up our figures, which are horribly low, far too low, and we acknowledge that. So we acknowledge we're not in the right place right now, and we're very pleased to adopt the review and the recommendations. We look forward perhaps to some movement on one of the recommendations from the government around the bail situation and RUI. But again, there's a complication. So I've looked into that. So why is it that so many suspects for serious sexual offences are RUI'd? Well, the answer is because it's taking 18 months plus to get through the investigation. Remand in custody and bail is far more challenging for that length of time than it would be if it was 3 months. But we are looking again at the guidance we're giving our own custody staff to say you need to be very, very careful. If there is a significant safeguarding concern, as it says in your recommendation, for the victim from the offender, then we have to be seriously considering how we process that defender. And RUI, particularly in relation to a domestic abuse-based rape, is not a good option to deal with and to keep people safe.
Okay, thank you very much for that, and it's good to hear that you're looking to move forward on all of this. But we obviously have been looking at the merged borough command units, which clearly has happened since this report. You looked at a case from April 2016. And would you accept, Deputy Commissioner, that you have lost considerable experienced staff, officers, as a result of these borough mergers from this specialist area? Some of your detectives and investigators have gone off to other forces as a result of these mergers.
So it's been significant change, as you know, moving to the new unit and bringing people together into the safeguarding unit. We've done it for the right reasons, I think, which is to try. So we've had, you know this, in the previous model we had artificial division between rape and domestic abuse and child abuse investigations. I think the more we learn, the more we realise this all needs to be coming together into a multidisciplinary unit that will work effectively across these crime type boundaries, which are artificial. So that's why we've done it. I think it's the right thing to do. As in any change, there's been dislocation, and we have lost some people who've decided they didn't want to, and often it's to do with travelling distances and things like that. Right. It's not, I think, disagreement particularly with the concept. It's just life's more difficult for them, so it's easier to travel to somewhere else. But we are seeing, as we know, an increase in recruiting into the Met, and we do know where we have gaps in relation to these units, and we are trying to plug those gaps as fast as we can. Bearing in mind we have demands across the organisation and gaps across the organisation.
A recent site visit that myself and Assembly members Arbour and Hall did in the summer to one of your BCUs, it was quite clear that they'd lost a lot of experienced detectives. So they had, yes, they may have some new police officers in, but they lack that experience that you perhaps need. And we also had the CPS at our site visit who said we're just not getting the number of referrals at all. Now, partly you've got an issue with digital forensics, partly you've had this issue with one of your, I don't know what the term is, forensic suppliers, that they've been compromised. That's now been resolved. But that's still this huge backlog for digital and other forensics. But are you concerned that you haven't got the right levels of staff and the right experience in there, and therefore we may actually see these figures get worse going forward rather than better?
Well, I can give you the figures overall for the MPS. So in terms of how many people do we want in our safeguarding units across the whole of the MPS, the answer is just under 2,400. And we've got just under 2,200 at this moment in time.
And so, what you won't have in those figures is how many of those 2,200 are perhaps on maternity leave, and therefore you have vacancies that effectively you're carrying, which is always a particular problem in this safeguarding arena rather than in other areas.
It is sometimes more exacerbated in that unit than elsewhere. which is why we are working so hard, I'm sure you know, on our policies around maternity leave and returners from maternity leave. And we've got a really strong programme to encourage people to come back and to make sure when they come back effective and fully up to speed with new legislation and new training. So we're working hard to encourage people to come back. We know that we lose quite a high number of women officers 4 years plus because of not usually the first child but the second child. Is usually the problem. So we've been running events to bring those people back into the organisation and those that are on maternity leave to encourage. So yeah, that is a problem, but we are trying to address that problem, and we are trying to increase numbers across the board. And I don't want to get back to it artificially, but if we get more officers, then some of those officers will go into safeguarding.
But what really concerned me, and we've done a couple of these BCU visits, is the workload, the strain the officers are under, the hours they're having to work. I can see why some people would leave, particularly if they've got caring responsibilities. But the fact that the supervision, the people who are supervising, which goes back to some of the points that Assemblymember Duval was making earlier, but supervision is just, they can't cope with what they're supposed to supervise, these managers. There are far fewer supervisors in place. They're managing hundreds of cases at any one time. You know, it doesn't feel to me that the model that you have put in place is right at the moment. And are you going to review that and make some adjustments, maybe on the basis of this rate review and the recommendations from the Victims Commissioner, but also from talking to frontline staff who are saying it's not really working at the moment?
So I would challenge that officers are carrying hundreds of cases. They're not.
The supervisors are. That's, I think, from the evidence. I realise, having bought my notebook with notes in, it's my previous one, so I haven't got the figures down here. But
So
that's what I picked up at
the sort of figures I'm looking at in terms of workload are ranging, and just it's a big spreadsheet, but ranging roughly from six files through to, I think I saw one about 16, which was the highest. So to be covering hundreds of officers, hundreds of files, a supervisor would have to be covering an awful lot of officers. I'm not sure I go along with the hundreds, if I'm honest. So we do keep a measure of what officers' caseload looks like, and that is supervised, and it is up to the supervisors to make sure that it stays equitable across the officers. I don't deny that these officers are working with a very heavy workload of some very traumatic material they're dealing with. But, you know, on the one hand, we're saying we're not putting enough work through, and on the other hand, we're saying our officers are working very, very hard. They are trying to put files through, but they're up against the things I've talked about, which is there is a huge blockage in time due to digital and due to the third-party reporting issue, the third-party information issues. I think we have got a model that will work. Is under constant review. So Amanda Pearson, who leads on the BCUs, is constantly doing reviews of all aspects of the BCUs and the work, and we're not in any way complacent about the model. You know, we haven't put the model in place, that's it, it's done now. It is under continual review. We're looking at it very regularly to make sure that we can try and make it as effective as possible. These officers are under pressure. It's a very high pressure area. If we had more, then we could alleviate that, but we need experienced officers, as you've indicated. We don't want to lose experience as well. So I'm not saying that this is a perfect situation, far from it. We know we need to do more. We know we need to improve our training around the trauma-informed situation. But a lot of it is down to the digital stuff causing huge delays, the disclosure situation being so challenging for officers, and the way the court process works does not assist the officers in putting files together quickly and moving it through the system.
Okay, thank you. We're kind of revisiting some of the issues that we've raised before. Sophie, perhaps you could let us know ASAP when this Justice Matters meeting is, because they're open for us to sit in, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, yes,
So
absolutely.
if you could let us know about
Yeah.
that, and we could then see the follow-up
No, of
action
course,
plan
yeah.
so that we can
Yeah.
keep a note on this. And
Yeah.
likewise, Claire, anything you're doing in this area, I know the committee is particularly interested in.
Without wanting to prolong it any further, but I just, in terms of reviewing of the BCU restructure, that is something that I meet Mark Simmons regularly and Amanda Pearson regularly to look at. And it's absolutely, and in terms of continuing to make sure that there aren't any tweaks that are needed. And the thing about the case files, I've also visited the BCUs to talk about what's happening in safeguarding and talk to officers. What has happened as well is that there is much greater visibility, and there is now the safeguarding dashboard which supervisors can now go into and absolutely see how many cases, and I don't know if you saw that when you were visiting. So there have been improvements, but as Steve says, it does have to be kept under review, and we do have to make sure that it's doing what it was expected to do. And I do also get reports back, and we can see from some of the Ofsted's reports coming back that safeguarding has improved, and the restructure has been part of that.
Okay, well, perhaps you might want to look at the number of cases supervisors and managing and so on, because that's certainly one of the many things I've picked up on these visits. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. So moving on, the next item, set of questions on preparations for a no-deal EU exit and implications for policing in London. Glenn.
I think the last time we asked questions around this, I think you was here, Steve.
Sorry, I do apologise.
No, it's fine.
You're very welcome to stay on, but I suspect you may have other things to do. Thank you again for coming.
I just wonder if you can just give us a general statement of just updating where we are on those preparations and your assessments that you've been asked to undertake.
So I think the one thing that's changed, probably simply due to the politics and the shifting timescales, is the public order situation in relation to this, which sort of goes up and down in terms of tension, based on, well, frankly, the politics and where we are in the process. So we're anticipating a fair level of demonstrations in London over the next few weeks and months in relation to Brexit. Everything else really is as it was the last time I spoke with you. So I chair a very regular Brexit meeting of all parts of the organisation to look at our readiness for Brexit. It's going to be a topic at the next Commissioner's Senior Leadership event, so that people are up to speed with what's going on, and we can pick up any ideas that they may have on any threats to our business continuity. But we cover all areas from our commercial contracts through to operational readiness for demonstrations and operational readiness on the BCUs in terms of any issues that may arise on BCUs, particularly working closely with the local councils to make sure we've got joined up plans around any issues that might occur.
Okay, so let's zone into some specifics then around some of the issues. So in terms of the additional operation pressures on potential deployment issues, are we envisaging cancelling leave, not leave? What's the thinking about that if no deal occurs?
Again, that's that is a bit fluid. We are anticipating if it's the 31st of October and we leave with no deal at that point, then that may be a day we have to cancel leave. It may be important to have as many officers available as possible. But as we can see from events in Parliament, we're certainly not in control of the situation, and therefore it has to remain quite fluid for us. We're well aware actually that we have far more cancelled all leave this year than in previous years. I think it's sort of approaching 15 days so far that are designated as red days, and normally I think the days are around about 4 or 5. So we're putting an awful lot of demands on our officers because of the elongation of this.
In those demands on officers, that would be also not just cancelling some of their leave arrangements, but also internal redeployment of officers. Is that part of the planning regime or not?
Yeah, I mean we're not looking at massive internal redeployment at this moment in time, because we don't know where the pressures are going to arise. It may be that it's a public order pressure in and around central London. It may be that it's actually other issues on BCUs, and we just need more officers on duty to deal with and provide public reassurance, really, on the BCUs. At the moment, we're not anticipating a large amount of mutual aid to other forces from the Met, and that's not something that we're being asked to provide in any big numbers at this moment in time.
Now, the big numbers, let's go on to that. In terms of mutual aid, I think the last time we discussed this, we were talking about Northern Ireland. We've already seen Police Scotland and their commitment. Our commitment, if asked by the police service of Northern Ireland, would be 150 officers. Is that still the case? I think when we were talking, you were just about to send them on their training,
yeah.
and it's mostly around public order. If we
Yeah,
have
and
to
some of these would also be specialist officers rather than simply public order officers in sheer numbers. So yeah, well, that's what we've trained up in public order tactics for Northern Ireland. Yeah.
And if that request came, what sort of deployment period would we be looking for them to relocate to Northern Ireland?
In terms of how long would it take?
No, the period of time. What
How
would
long
be
would they
the
be there?
minimum? What would be the?
Well, I mean, there would be no point in them going for a single day. We would expect them to be going for 2 or 3 days, probably up to a week, but not much more than that.
And that's what you'd be looking at in terms of managing those numbers.
Yeah, and because we've got 150 that are trained, obviously we may not send all of those at any one time, because if it's going to be an ongoing commitment, then it would be pointless sending them all one week and not having any the next week. But I think it's important to say here we haven't had any request from PSNI for any mutual aid so far. If we get some, we will look at it, but we haven't had a request yet.
But it's something that you keep constantly under review,
We
and
do,
you have
yeah.
to be on standby to deliver if that request is made.
Sure, but we have to be on standby to deliver mutual aid to a number of forces nationally if it's required.
It's I think it's slightly different from being deployed down into Kent to help them out marshalling the lorries, or maybe some civil disorder there, to being redeployed to Northern Ireland. I think there's slightly a different context.
Well, that's acknowledged because the tactics is different. That's just why they've had the extra training, yes.
Yes, okay. In terms of the other issues, just on some of the preparations that government have, some of the stuff that's either been leaked or government has put into the public domain, in terms of planning for the resilience of these issues and around that, one of the missing bits is the gap about people's behaviour. Now, the police have done lots of work around public order issues and behaviour, what happens in certain circumstances, and some, learning lessons from the past and all the rest of it. In terms of some of the other deployment issues around, there's been talk of Yellowhammer around fuel shortages, issues around food distribution. We're told it's not the worst case scenario. This is possible scenarios in terms of no deal. What would be the role of the police in those circumstances around making sure that the right goods get to it if there are issues around human behaviour that necessitates you taking action? What's the thinking around that?
So your phrase human behaviour is the one I would focus on. So we will respond to outbreaks of disorder, and we will respond to criminality. We won't be providing any sort of assistance with the distribution chain short of that. So they may well, if there are fuel shortages, and I've no idea whether that's going to be the scenario or not, but if there are fuel shortages and it's properly managed by the companies and by the petrol stations, then the police will not be involved in that. Obviously, if there is disorder, then as there would be for any other reason, as there would be a disorder at a football match or anywhere else, the police will engage.
And let's look at the other side of leaving the EU, whether it's no deal or not, and some of the arrangements we've had with the EU which will cease at some stage. How are those negotiations going? Are they being held? I mean, of course, the MPS is in a special position by its size, locus, and other issues with our European partners. So, of course, we're sitting at the table of these debates, but presumably nationally that they're being dealt with. where are we on some of those programmes that I think have been raised with you before around what, we can't, if we leave, we can't keep those programmes, they have to be different, but clearly there are arrangements to try and maintain some semblance of cooperation with those on the European mainland around dealing with criminality. So where are we on that?
So it is a UK-wide approach to this. It's being led by one of our officers, a DAC. Richard Martin is leading it, but he's leading on behalf of the UK. The unit he's set up is the International Crime Coordination Centre. It's based in London, but it has single points of contact across all the forces in the United Kingdom. And what it's doing is putting in place a network so that forces can, as easily as possible, access the replacement arrangements that will be in place in the event of the existing arrangements not being in place.
Are they temporary arrangements, and will there be? Do you envisage a period of once that we can sort of renegotiate those to increase the capabilities, or do you? I suppose from a committee's point of view, are there temporary arrangements in place? They're not the same as what they were in the past, but are there options in the future? Do you envisage that where maybe new treaties, new renegotiations can be once things have settled down, if and when, or if we leave the EU?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably not that dissimilar to trade arrangements in many respects. In that, given time, we will be able to enter into agreements with countries. I think there is a question as to whether or not we can do that bilaterally, or whether we have to do it with the EU as a group. That has to be bottomed out, really. But yeah, I think as time goes on, we may well be able to put in place more effective alternative arrangements. What we're actually going to go to in the event of us leaving, in many cases actually, is sort of the predecessor to what was in place before the EU came along.
Yes.
And so they are in existence, but they are often not as effective as what's in place right now.
And would it lead to, I suppose, long term? I mean, the Metropolitan Police has got a good record of international cooperation that extends more than just in terms of protocols and processes. And in some places, would it lead to further international deployment of embedded officers in some locations, if it warranted that, on behalf of UK police?
So that's a role that's really been taken over by the National Crime Agency?
So they would do that rather than yourselves?
Yeah.
And they would facilitate any handling and liaison type roles that might occur? Yeah. And is there a pattern around the sorts of criminality that we've been dealing with? We must have some history now of how those processes have worked on our behalf. Is there a pattern of where it might be appropriate to focus on? I don't want to criminalise, so I don't want to name the countries, but is there a pattern where you would focus in a certain region of where it may well be to our advantage to have that sort of liaison by the National Crime Agency?
I think it's common sense, Len. You know, if you look at where the NCA has liaison officers based, they're based where there is business, to put it crudely. But they're not based where there's no business. So, yes.
So it's already in existence?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Chair, I just want to move on to some...
Can I just add a couple of things in terms of that? Obviously, your questions about leaving, it depends whether there's deal or no deal. Because if we leave with no deal, there'll be nothing. Yeah. And then if there is a deal, there are some transitional arrangements, and then it's what happens after that. But even with a deal, we won't be part of Eurojust, we won't be part of Europol, we won't be sitting at the strategic table having influence over strategic decisions, we won't have the joint investigation team. So you may be able to put some bilateral arrangements in place, but we will lose significant influence over crime and security in Europe, and that's incredibly important. And then there's, of course, there's the issue around extradition, that some countries will not extradite to another country if they're not part of the European Union, Germany being one, and it's in their constitution. So I cannot see that being a very easy path to having bilateral agreements with Germany when they'll have to have a referendum on their constitution. So there is just there is not a good place. It's an even worse place as no deal. But even leaving Europe with a deal will be very difficult in some areas.
Thank you for that intervention. And are the police and crime commissioners across England and Wales, is this eye on their agenda, and are they lobbying the Home Office to say, look, okay, whatever happens here, we've got to do more, and regardless of what status are, what are you doing, UK government, around this?
It is. I mean, it's one of the things that we have regular meetings with all police and crime commissioners. We have had discussions around Brexit. We have a lead police and crime commissioner for Brexit, Lord Willie Back, who's the PCC for Leicestershire, is the lead on this in terms of lobbying the government.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Chair, just leaving on. Forgive me, Deputy Commissioner. My office was in contact with someone in the police preparing your briefing today, and gave notice that I'd be asking questions around some issues that I raised with the Commissioner. I understand that you don't think that's in your briefing note, and it's regarding the investigation into, what are they, remind me, Leave EU, in terms of 2 allegations. Back in May this year, the Commissioner was at this meeting. The meeting was also joined by the Electoral Commission. In fact, the day before, the Metropolitan Police Service signed a very unique protocol with them about how they would do any future investigations arising on it. The trouble was, I mean, in terms of the Commissioner, it was quite clear she was expecting some results in a week. I don't want to go into details of the investigation. I'm not asking about that. It's now 3 months later, and people are becoming concerned about how this investigation has proceeded with. There are parallels to other investigations in the past, and again, can you, if it's not in your brief notes, can you give any indication of when there might well be some news about what is, I think, an important investigation regarding democracy, really, and some of those issues. And there are parallels with what happened in I think we can say in terms of Tower Hamlets, but I don't want to go into the Tower Hamlets issue around on that. Could you give us any updates? Or
the update I can give you is, as we know, we're dealing with 3 specific individuals' cases. One case is with the CPS for their consideration.
Right.
And we are proceeding with the other 2 cases. They're not yet with the CPS.
So can you just say, on the latter bit, I didn't quite...
We are proceeding with the other 2 cases, but they are not yet with the CPS.
Fine, okay.
But we expect they will be.
And look, I don't, inevitably, one doesn't want to put pressure on, but is there an expectation of a time aspect to those, the last 2, because it has been some period. The allegations previously were in 2018.
So the case that is with the CPS was referred early last month.
Yep.
I haven't got a timescale for the other 2 cases, but I don't expect it to be a very long period of time.
Okay.
I can't do better than that, I'm afraid.
Now, on the other issues, can I just go back? The Commission made some very, I don't want to quote the Commissioner verbatim about the Electoral Commission. I think we can safely say that both sides said some very good words about each other. Literally, in the space of May, and we get to July, we see some very uncomplimentary things said about the Electoral Commission, which they did not recognise, that came in an exchange of letters that became public. I don't believe the Commissioner misled this committee. I don't believe she misled this committee of what she said. I don't understand how that can be in the space of that period of time over a period of commenting over a period preceding up to what the Commissioner was reporting to this committee and saying to this committee. What happened? What was this about, to be honest? You know, because it's certainly not something this committee would recognise from the meeting in May of somehow that deteriorating in this really exchange from the MPS of blaming another agency for their supposed failings.
So I spoke to Alex Murray, who's the commander leading this investigation yesterday. What he was keen for me to stress is that he has a very good working relationship with the Electoral Commission. And on a day-to-day basis, they have differences of opinion about things, but in general, the relationship is a good working relationship. We believe we've got all the information and data that we need to carry out the investigation from the Electoral Commission, and are in a position to proceed with it. And relationships, as I say, are good. We're trying to work with them on MOU to sort of put it on a more official footing, but he's happy with the working relationship. I don't really have the detail to go into why it looked different in print, really.
Would you want to write to me then?
Can
and
do.
To copy to this committee?
Sure.
And try, because it's such a damning exchange by, I think, your legal officers within the MPS in terms of the Electoral Commission. Now, presumably, they're commissioned by somebody else. Someone must have given them that information for them to write to the Electoral Commission in that way. And or, I mean, almost certainly, who put it into the public domain. It wouldn't be the Electoral Commission put it into public domain. It can only have come from one other source. And the sources are only, we presume it's tight. It's either the MPS or the Electoral Commission. I would not want, if I was an Electoral Commission, to put what was said about me into the public domain. So I'm only leading to the view that someone in the MPS sought to put that into the public domain to defend their position of why they'd not proceeded with the cases in, from my point of view, in a timely manner. I made a flippant remark about saying that every time I seem to write a letter to, I think it was then Commander Jerome, that something happened incrementally. And of course, you know, it just appears like that. I just think someone needs to ask some other questions about how long this has taken and why. And it does go back, and it goes back to an earlier conversation, which is so unusual in terms of the Met. It's either the too difficult box or the sensitive issue, or it's about rich and powerful people being able to, or the police not willing to go into those difficult, complex areas. I'm very grateful for you telling me we got to CPS. It just seems to me it's a matter of whether the law has been broken or it's not. And I'm not going to come looking for you if you come back and tell me it's not, to be honest. I think we just want, but the length of time it takes just gives a further doubt that that the MPS is either A, not taking it seriously, or two, doesn't want to proceed with it because it's in that too difficult box. And it's not just me saying that, there are other commentators, and I do think then that goes back to some of the original things raised earlier on about reputational damage that is unnecessary around, you know, how we pick and choose which investigations we're going to do. I know you personally, Deputy Commissioner, do not pick and choose crimes. You go and chase the evidence, and if there is evidence, and you bring people to book. But there's something about these particular issues that the Met has problems with. And I just don't understand. And I know they're complex, and I know it does take time sometimes, but in terms of what's been presented to me, and exchanges of letters, and then issues saying we're going to do this and that, and then see subsequently this exchange in the press between a leaked letter, a challenging another agency about their failings, does make me not feel comfortable with this approach.
Okay.
Please, what you're telling me today but maybe you could write to us.
I can write, but can I just take a quick stab at the letter business?
Yep.
So, effectively, the Metropolitan Police Service wrote a letter to a solicitors company who were criticising us for the delay, and we rebutted the allegation that we were causing the delay. That was a letter from us back to the solicitors. That's the letter that was made public.
Ah, right. Okay, so
It's not my view that we made it public.
Yeah. Okay.
But I don't know who did make it public.
Okay. Right. I get that. I can understand.
But it wasn't a letter direct from the Commissioner back to the Electoral Commission.
No, I knew it was from your legal department.
No, it wasn't a letter from us
to the legal department
to the Electoral Commission.
It was to a third party.
It was to a third party.
Okay, right, I get that. And I understand the third party is considering legal action against the MPS over this issue or the failure of the progress in terms of this issue. Okay, I get that, and I'm glad to be corrected that there's another potential source of those issues. I still stand by the contents of the letter is still not the same, and I do not believe, and I don't believe any of these members, because there's been no occasion that I can ever go back of you or Cressida or even her predecessors at this level, at senior management board, ever misleading this committee. So I think what the Commission was telling me was the truth, as she was told it, and where it was. And I'm very glad that you've repeated that today in terms of the officer that's overseeing the investigation at the moment. There is still a problem here of why this occurred.
Okay.
And I think we'd like to hear in a bit more detail about how you can do that.
Thanks, Glenn.
Right, I'm very aware
No.
we're short
You've
of
been
time.
patient. And
So if I could just go back to the Brexit planning and just make a comment. When we leave the EU on the 31st of October, can we make sure that there is planning in place for dancing in the street parties and joyous exuberance from millions of us? I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
And on that note, we'll move to the last set of questions on facial recognition. Sean, and you've been very patient as well. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair.
I think we put this item over from the last meeting, didn't we? So carry on.
Well, at the last meeting, we were awaiting that day the publication of the evaluation by Essex University. So we thought we would revisit it again today. And it turns out that's also quite timely. The first question I have for you, Deputy Commissioner, is have you now released your technical evaluation report on your trial of facial recognition technology?
No, we haven't released it yet.
And when will you release it?
I don't know. But I see no reason why it shouldn't be released. I don't know why it hasn't been released, but it may be it's simply ongoing and we're still working on it, but I can find out, to be honest. No, we haven't released it yet. I asked that question. I don't have a date when it is to be released.
Okay, we were expecting it at the same time as the Essex one originally.
Right, okay. Right.
But yeah, if they're not coming out together, then we would expect to see it quite soon. The second question is, you didn't, after in the course of publishing the Essex University review, you didn't exercise your right of reply on the report. So what is your view of the report?
I don't have a personal view of the report.
I'm speaking on behalf of the Met, I guess, today.
So we went out to. So obviously, there was the ethics report from the Mayor's ethics panel, and then we commissioned the Essex report to give us differing views on facial recognition. And I guess we've got differing views on facial recognition because the Mayor's panel report seemed generally positive, so long as it's constrained and proportionate. The Essex report took a different tack, I think. So useful to get different views. And we await the JR from South Wales to see what that brings us as well in terms of a different view.
So I asked at the 3rd of July meeting here whether the Met would again use facial recognition technology now that the trial had finished. Mark Simmons, the Assistant Commissioner, said we have stopped current work on facial recognition in terms of active operational use of it so that we can take stock of what we've done. Deputy Mayor said, we've been clear there should be no further use of any of the technology until the 5 recommendations of the London Policing Ethics Panel have been addressed, and that does include a review of the 2 reports, and then the second report she was referring to was the technical evaluation. So can you confirm you're not using it currently on the streets? Because I have reports, eyewitness reports of facial recognition marked vans out on the weekend at the pro-democracy protest that took place after the prorogation of Parliament.
We don't have vans marked facial recognition, and we're not deploying facial recognition on the streets.
I'm quite well aware of what a facial recognition van looks like, and I've had the van described to me that passed through Trafalgar Square.
Right.
It meets the description. Can you confirm it was not used at that pro-democracy protest?
We have not used and are not using facial recognition. It was a pilot. It was used on 10 occasions. The last one, I think, was in Romford many months ago, and we're not using it.
Can you just try and track down and confirm what that van was that people saw there?
Circuit TV could be the mobile.
Sorry, I mean, if you want to write to me with the details, I can have it looked at.
Okay, sorry, Steve. Sorry, not to just to be clear. It did say facial recognition on it. Is the report that we have had? No one was inventing that.
So that you can qualify.
I will endeavour to get you some evidence of what people saw, and if you can explain that evidence to me, that would be very, very useful.
Well, I may not be able to explain it to you, but I'm telling you that we are not using facial recognition on the streets of London.
Okay, that's good to know.
And we stopped when I said we'd stop, which was it. I think Romford was the last one we did.
That was the final trial that you did. Okay, I mean that is good to know, but obviously very worrying to have heard these reports from Saturday. At the 14th of May Police and Crime Committee, the Commissioner was asked about the potential compilation of facial recognition watch lists based on protests and protester images captured on the streets, and asked whether anything other than custody images were being used to compile watch lists for automated facial recognition. Now, she, like you just now, expressed some kind of surprise that I should even ask this, but she did promise to write with more information, and I've not had any reply to that yet. Can I chase that up via you today? And
sure.
If you have any information,
right, well, we'll make a note of that. I apologise you've not had that.
Okay, great. Okay, so my final question, I think, is that the judgment has now come out on the judicial review of South Wales Police's trials of facial recognition. This concludes that these trials were possible under the law as it stands, based on the fact they were used for a limited time and for specific and limited purposes in each case as a trial. This judgment is being appealed by Liberty, and the judicial review against your own Metropolitan Police trials is currently under a stay because you are not using it. That's why I'm so interested in whether or not you have used it again on the streets. Can we expect, though, in light of the judgment today, that you might start redeploying it, or will you wait, as promised at the last meeting, for the full evaluation to take place onto the 2 reports?
So, what we're waiting for is the judicial review from South Wales, which we're interested in. Obviously, I haven't got the information you've got, so I didn't know that. We are waiting for a full evaluation of the reports we're talking about, and most importantly, we're waiting to make sure that Management Board has a proper discussion about how, where, when, and if we will deploy facial recognition on the streets of London. I have to say, I think it's appropriate to say, because we're interested in being, I don't want to be hiding anything from you. My view is that facial recognition should be deployed on the streets of London, so long as it is so long as it is done within a legal framework. And if the JR is saying that there is a legal framework, and I haven't seen it, so I don't honestly know. We have approached the Home Secretary to say, if it's not clear, we would like clarity on facial recognition. The Commission has said that on many occasions around the legislation or use of it, but we would also pay a great deal of attention to, and I think be bound by what the panel or the sample of 1,000 Londoners said, which was actually 84% were happy that it would be used for serious crime, but increasingly less so for minor offences. that's pretty much where we are, in the proportionate use we think is the right thing to do. I think to ignore a technology like this is not only folly, but probably pointless.
It needs regulation and
oversight.
And
completely agree.
Potentially, as you know, ethical tests are very, very hard to meet, particularly for serious crimes where the consequences of misidentification, and we await your technical report, are much more serious for serious crimes. Those two different sets of balances are actually in conflict with each other.
I accept that entirely. Can I say though that, just for the interest of members, we have a strong view that the levels of accuracy reflected in media reports on facial recognition, including the pilots we've used, have not been accurate themselves, and that the accuracy is significantly higher than has been reported.
Obviously, the Essex report challenged effectively the denominator of your accuracy figures.
Yeah.
So there are.
And I have a number of scientists who disagree with that, but there we are.
To turn to the Deputy Mayor, I don't know if you have any further comment to make. I think your comments last time were quite clear. We still do not have the two reports, but the Commissioner is reported today as saying in Sydney, I think yesterday, that we do need to be careful that we don't sleepwalk into what she described as a ghastly Orwellian omniscient police state, and essentially seemed to be crying out for some regulatory, ethical, political direction on all of this. Are you and the Mayor preparing to offer her that, and bearing all the evidence that we've seen in mind?
So I think that's what that is why we asked the ethics panel to have a look at this, and I absolutely agree with Steve in terms of having to look at the technical report and the evaluation of that, but that we've also, and we've agreed with the Mayor, that there won't be any further use of facial recognition until the recommendations of the ethics panel have been addressed. And on top of that, the Mayor has already written to the government to ask for legislation, regulation, or proper standards around the use of live facial recognition, and we'll continue to lobby to do that. I haven't seen the judicial review either. We'll have to take a look at it, but we'll still need a really clear framework, and I think that's what the Commissioner was asking for in her comments there. When the biometric Commissioner produced his report last year, he said there needed to be clear, or she actually, I don't know who it is, can't remember who it is. He said that there needs to be clear standards around the use of live facial recognition, and the Home Office agreed with that, said they would work to put those guidelines in place. They aren't there, so we will continue to lobby for that.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just be clear on one thing though? Our view is that there should be clear national guidance, whether it's legislation or other form, around the use of facial recognition live time by the police service. We're completely up for that. But once that's in place, the view the Commissioner has, which I want to echo here, is it's an operational tool and will be deployed at the view of the Commissioner, so long as the guidance is there. This is just we're taking baby steps here at the moment.
I think you've been quite clear today that while we don't have that, while we haven't finished our evaluation, it will not be used, and that will be reassuring to some people today.
Well, no, sorry, I need to be clear here. If the JR, which I have no idea what it says, is saying actually you can go ahead, then that's a different matter, because if the Home Office refuse or say you don't need more guidance, you don't need more legislation, then we will be faced with a situation of we may have to go ahead.
With respect,
we would prefer guidance.
The assurances we were given last time were based on the publication and evaluation of the two reports, which we still don't have, and the ethical tests, not on any other legal case. So hopefully those assurances do stand, given the conditions that you set at the last.
I was probably trying to offer you more assurance. What I'm saying is, if the JR says that the legislation currently is okay, and we go through the test you've just talked about, then we will feel free to go ahead if we think that's the right thing to do. We just need to wait and see actually how the Home Office responds in terms of, is there clarity right now or is there not?
Okay, we'll be keeping a very close eye on anything that occurs on our streets. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Fine. Okay. On that note, can I thank our guests for attending today and for the answers to our questions. Can I ask the committee to know the discussion and the report from MOPAC attached at Appendix 1 to the report?
Noted.
Item 6, can I ask the committee to note the progress on our work programme as set out in the report? Note the summary of the site visit to the South West Borough Command Unit on the 7th of August 2019.
Noted.
And delegate authority to me in consultation with party group lead members and Carnival Pigeon to agree an annual report summarising the work of the committee of the last year.
Noted.
Yep, thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for Thursday, 19th of September at 10 a.m. in the Chamber, City Hall. And as I have no other business, I now declare the meeting closed.
Thank you.